Welcome to the Strategy Supper Club. In this video, we're talking about the relationship between strategists and creatives. And we're really going to dig deep into that oh so tricky thing of giving ridiculously good creative feedback. Feedback that not only gets to the kind of work that makes clients happy, makes for really successful campaigns in the marketplace, but feedback that also strengthens and preserves the relationships that we have with our creative teams. So as ever, we've recorded me teaching the class to a group of people online. We've cut together some really juicy Q&A because I taught the class more than once. And most of all, we hope that you really enjoy this and get something out of it. As ever, if you want to chat or have any questions, you can hit me up on Twitter, and I hope to see you in a class soon. All right, let's talk about how to give ridiculously good, and I did it again, creative feedback. Okay, so one of the reasons that this topic is near and dear to my heart is because when I started in the industry, I actually started as a creative. I was a junior baby copywriter for the first 2 years that I worked at FCB with Eric, and I was a pretty terrible copywriter, to be quite honest with you. I think it's really good that I found my calling in strategy. But what those 2 years of being a copywriter taught me was what it's like to put your idea down on a table and have a room full of people judge it, pick it apart, criticize it or critique it, try to make it stronger. It's quite an experience to go through as a creative. And I would like to think that having gone through that experience as a creative had made me more empathetic and just hopefully a better partner to creatives as I pursued strategy. And some of the things that I deeply felt and learned when I was a creative, I'm just hoping to share with you today. So today I have 8 principles that I'm sharing. They are by no means exhaustive, but these are 8 principles that I continue to go back to when I'm giving creative feedback and when I'm trying to teach other strategists how to do it as well. And hopefully it will be helpful to you. So as I was putting together this presentation, something came to mind in that our teams are weird and they're pretty miraculous that they actually work. Because if you think of a team that works on any sort of engagement or advertising campaign, they are composed of so many different types of people. Your prototypical account person is so different than a prototypical digital strategist, and so different than a producer, and so different than a strategist. We just have different temperaments. We have different motivations for doing the work that we do. We have very different tools that we deploy to do our work. And so I think it's actually pretty miraculous that the whole thing works as often as it does. And I think that one of the things that helps it work is when we can be good team members to one another and create good energy on the teams that we work on. And that's something you're going to hear me talk a lot about today, is this concept of energy. So spoiler alert on the rest of this presentation, there are things that are very functional in here, but I think a big part of giving creative feedback well is being really cognizant about the energy that you bring into a space and how your energy affects other people's energy. And so we're going to talk about that a lot, and it's going to be threaded through everything as well. So it's pretty miraculous when it works. And yes, as we know, we are all creative. That was a big thing I feel like that swept through the industry like 10 or 15 years ago, saying that creativity is not just in the creative department. Like, yes, we all get it. We're all creative. However, what I will say is that gaps do exist between strategists and creatives. And it's not only driven by everything that I talked about in the previous slide or so, but it's also just driven by institutional and structural differences in the way that these disciplines have been treated over the course of this industry's life. So if you think about back in Mad Men era and back and actually extended on pretty far into almost modern era, creatives were put on a pedestal. They sat in their own spaces. They were mythic. They were the people that we weren't supposed to disturb. But now that we're in more of a mosh pit of working, and our media environments have gotten so much more complicated, and the problems have gotten more windy in trying to solve them, that I think those old norms are starting to break down. But I would say that they're not completely broken down yet. And it's something that I'm still very cognizant of when I'm working with creatives. So the thing that I always remind myself, especially on the days where I'm getting frustrated with team members or feel like I'm not delivering creative feedback well, and it's just not like the process isn't working very well, is that we need each other. And working in a client service business is hard enough.
And if we are pissing match with people on our teams, it makes it so much harder. So a lot of the principles that I'm putting forward in just a moment are about like, let's take care of each other. Let's make sure that we're being good team members. And to just culminate that thought, today is all about bringing 100% to your 50%. Now, this is a concept that I actually learned in therapy in the last year or so, but it's such a powerful concept. It resonates so deeply with me. And it's the idea that in every relationship that we have, in every interaction that we have between two people, ourselves being one of them, we are responsible for only 50% of that interaction. We cannot control the other person. We cannot dictate the kind of energy that they bring to the situation. We can only control what we have in our own domain. But within our own domain, we need to work really hard to bring 100% to that. And that takes a lot of self-awareness. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of love for the people around you. So this is a mantra that I try to keep in mind all the time. Like if I'm, with my partner or something and he's kind of annoying me a little bit, I just remind myself, like, I can't change what he's doing, but I can be completely responsible for the way that I'm showing up and the energy that I'm bringing. And I feel like this is a really good principle for strategists to remember when they are giving creative feedback and working with those teams. So without further ado, let's get into it. The very first principle, and I've already nodded to it in the beginning of this, is have empathy. Now, empathy has been a bit of an overused concept. It's a very stylish concept right now, I would say, in the business world and especially in our industry. But I think it has a lot of merit, and it's a concept that I think is surging because it is so important to the way we do business, but it's also not a way that we classically think about doing business. And I think this is especially important in the strategist creative relationship, because something that I think is very important for strategists to remember is that a creative action and creating something that other people look at and judge is one of incredible vulnerability on the part of the creative. I have felt, I can say with 100% confidence that it was much more exposing for me as a young creative to write a script than it's ever been for me to write a strategic line. Because when I used to write scripts, it was really exposing, like, this is my mind. This is my humor. This is what I believe in. This is what I think is good. This is what I think is bad. There is a sense of their own personality getting mapped into the work of it. Even the most diligent creatives, the most professional creatives are going to show who they are in the work that they create against a brief. And I don't think that any other discipline in the industry has to have that exposure in the way that a creative does. And so when you do expose yourself like that, especially in a business context, especially in a context where there's a lot of different people looking in on it, that can be quite frightening. So whenever I'm working with creatives and whenever I'm giving feedback, I try to remember to have the grace, to have empathy for the fact that what they're doing is incredibly brave. It's very vulnerable. And they're probably, especially if they're a younger creative, pretty scared. And so how do we make sure that we are creating spaces that honor that? And that's a big gift that we can give creatives as strategists as we work through these processes. The next principle that I'd like to talk about, and this one I think is so important, is to always, and I mean always, always, always lead with what's working first. So I get it. Like, we are in an industry that is very fast paced. The pressure is on, especially now, to deliver for clients. The pressure is on to get it right. And I think there's a really big temptation that when we are evaluating a piece of creative, we immediately want to fix it and get it right as quickly as possible so we don't waste any time and we don't disappoint the clients. But in giving creative feedback, if we only hit the creatives in the beginning with everything that's wrong with it, emotionally, they are going to start to build a wall. And it's much more difficult to work with a creative that builds a wall and to also make work that is better when there is that wall. So what I always try to remember to do is take the 2 to 5 minutes in the beginning of feedback and point out everything that's working. Point out the things that we can build on, the things where they got it right, the things where what they are doing is really working. And what you're doing then in your feedback loop is saying, let's build on a place of strength versus let's knock down what's not working. And then what you can do when you identify those places of strength, you can say, like, this is the core of it. This is the nut. This is the thing that's really working. Let's build from there. And when we build from there, it is naturally going to knock off some of the things that aren't working, but ultimately we're building from a place of strength. So not only does this set up the work and the process to be that much better, it also is just a much better and more empathetic way of working with your creatives. Because if someone comes up to you right away and says, this is what you're doing wrong, this is how it's not right, this, nah, nah, anyone, any of us immediately is going to shut down, right? But if someone comes up to you and says, hey, you killed it on this thing, it's amazing. But when you're working on that thing, do you think maybe we could like try this little thing differently? Your spirit opens up more. And I think we need to remember that we are working with humans and that they're being vulnerable, to our first point. And if we lead with what's working and we lead with confidence in them, then the whole process and the relationship is that much better. Let's move on to principle 3, which is strategic first, creative second. The way I think about working on creative work and working on campaigns is like you're building a house and then you've got to paint the house, right? And if you think about building the house, the first thing that's really important when you're designing a house is you make sure that the house has the right amount of rooms, the house has the right frame, the house is the right style. And then only much further on do you decide, okay, so therefore we're going to paint the living room blue. It's kind of the same when we're working with creatives. A lot of times, especially in the early phases of a creative project, when the first round of creative comes back, which is often gloriously messy, and there's something really beautiful about that mess, it's really tempting as strategists to not only say it's not working strategically, but here's all the things you're doing executionally with like discrete creative decisions that also aren't working. I would encourage you, if your team has the processes and the time, to not get into the minutia of creative feedback in the first round of feedback, if you can. The most important thing in those early rounds is to make sure that the structure of the idea is working. Is it speaking to the right people? Is it communicating what we wanted to say? And a lot of times in the beginning, when we first get creative work, it's not saying yes and yes to those foundational strategic questions. So what I'd really encourage you to do is make sure in your early rounds of feedback that you're focusing on those things and getting those things right. And if there are things that are executionally off and you know they're off, just let them sit. Let them sit to the side. Because what often happens is that as you're fixing the frame of the idea, the executional decisions morph and they move along and you don't even have to comment on them. The danger in commenting on all of it is that you're just overwhelming your creatives with feedback. You're hitting them with way too many things at once too early in the process. And so in a situation like this, where we have a big mess of stuff, there's strategic issues and there's executional issues, I work with my creatives to get the strategic issues done properly first, and then get their mind cleared on that, get the foundation solid, make sure there's something tight that we can all hold on to. And then once those strategic decisions are figured out and they're done beautifully and gracefully, then turn and clean up the executional issues as well. It's kind of like if you were working with an architect, you would never say to them on the first meeting, I want the living room to be blue. You would say, I want this style of house. I want this many rooms. I want this kind of thing. It's kind of the same principle. It's like, don't hit them with all the little tiny stuff before the big stuff is in place. Moving on to the next principle, which is feedback, not solutions. The reason that this one is in here is because this is one that I particularly struggle with. I think it's so tempting sometimes, and I've seen strategists do this a lot, where we are just tempted to want to solve the executional problems for the creator on the spot. So for example, we will say, we'll see a headline. The headline might read a little too aggressive for the tonality that we want in the campaign. And instead of saying to the creator, hey, it's reading a little aggressive, I think it's this word that's really toning it aggressive, could you take another run at that? Sometimes we're super tempted to just rewrite the headline on the spot. And I know we're all creative geniuses at heart, but at the end of the day, we really need to resist that impulse to give feedback via solving the executional problems versus giving feedback via principles. I've learned this the hard way. I've learned it the hard way because I can't tell you how many times I have suggested an executional solution to feedback, and a creative will kind of look at me and they'll be like, all right, whatever. And then they'll go away and they'll understand what the principle that I was solving for and come back with 10 headlines that are way better than anything I could have written. And it really is such a humbling experience. And it always kind of makes me laugh at myself that, yeah, there's a reason you're not a copywriter anymore. But really what this has to do with is trust. And it's trusting that your creatives are fertile creators. And if you tell them the headline is too aggressive, they're going to be able to fix it. And you don't have to go solve it for them. You just need to trust that they can fix it. And when you show the creatives that you trust them like that, you are building better team energy and you're building a better relationship with those creatives in the long run. So try not to solve it for them in the execution. Try to give them the principles of what's not working and trust that they can go create against it. Okay, the fifth one. And the fifth one for me has a lot to do with clients as much as it has to do with creatives. And that is, when in doubt, go back to your audience. I think we've all, or most of us, have been in rooms where the feedback starts to spin. One camp likes one thing, another camp likes another thing. They start battling it out with each other. And at the end of the day, you can just see that this is just never going to get resolved, because ultimately it's about the subjective opinion of one camp versus the subjective opinion of another camp. And if it goes on too long, ego starts to come in, and then the whole thing just starts to get ugly. Whenever I find myself in a situation like this, where the camps start to form, where feedback is getting hyper subjective, when there's a lot of I language going on, like, I think this is how it should be, I think that this is how it should go. The thing that I always do is I take a deep breath and I try to remind myself and the room, like, let's go back to the audience. Because if I've done my job correctly as a strategist, I have built a brief that is chock full of audience insights. A brief that really allows everybody on the team to understand the audience and almost walk the world in their shoes and see things through their eyes. And when you bring the concept of the audience into a room that has developed camps, that concept of the audience becomes a really strong neutralizer, where it's like, okay, yeah, you're right. This isn't about me. This isn't about what I want or what I think. Let's think about what would feed and fuel and delight the audience the most. And this has proven to be a really strong tool for me in getting agencies and clients back on track when the feedback starts to get too personal and too subjective. Okay, the next one is practice energetic jujitsu. I warned you guys that we were going to be talking about energy, and this one is hitting the energy point over the head. So I've been so lucky to work with so many different creative teams with so many different personalities over the course of my career. I've also been really lucky to work with some genuinely genius, world-class creatives. Doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it is quite magical to work with people who are truly gifted and truly amazing at their jobs. And there is a difference. There is a difference between the ones that are innately confident and innately talented versus the ones that aren't. And this is what I've observed in my career. If I come from a good place in feedback, if I've delivered it thoughtfully, if the feedback is smart, if it's delivered in a way that's like real, like one team, one dream, like I'm trying to really help the work, 95% of the time, the really great, talented, confident creatives will welcome that feedback. They will welcome that feedback, even if you're like, you know what, I just don't think this idea is working and we need to like scrap it and move on to the next one. Because the great ones have the confidence that they can either fix it or they can come up with another idea. Creativity to them is not something that is limited. It is something that is very expansive. But I've also had the experience many times in my career where someone's really pushing back on me. They can sometimes get rude. They can sometimes be a jerk. They can be arrogant. They can be like, well, I'm the creative, you're the strategist, you don't know anything. I've heard that a couple times in my career. They won't collaborate. And they generally just, their energy shuts down. And I used to get really pissed off about that. I used to think that fighting fire with fire was the right way to handle that kind of situation. But what I've realized more now is that the reason that they're pushing back on me like that is because ultimately they're afraid. And if I match their energy, I'm going to just beat any good energy out of that team, and the whole thing's just going to go in a deadlock. So this is where I think strategists have to be quite zen. We have to be the ones who don't match that energy and instead look to change the energy in the room. And I found that in situations like that, when someone punches me, I have to do everything in my power not to punch back, but instead meet them with confident kindness. And if you can meet them with confident kindness, a lot of times you can get them to relax, open up, and start to collaborate with you. Now, sometimes you can't get that done in one room in one moment. And if I do find that a creative is just completely shutting down and is having a really difficult time dealing with the feedback, something that I'll suggest is I'll put it back on me. I'll say, you know what? You're bringing up a lot of good points, and they're points that I just haven't considered before, and I'd like to take some time to think about them. Can we regroup in a half hour or like in an hour, just so I have time to process it? Because I think what you're saying is I really want to be able to like think about it and process it. And that's not why I'm doing it. It's not because I can't process it. It's because I need to break the energy in the room. And sometimes breaking the energy in the room means literally breaking up the room and letting it air out and then regrouping later on. So there's a lot of ways to change energy. I'd say the most extreme example is breaking up the room and asking people to reconvene. But just remember that you have so much power as a person, as an individual in any situation and in a creative feedback situation to shift energy. And sometimes when we're working with creatives that are afraid, we really have to tap into that and make sure that we develop that superpower. Okay, this one is a 101, so I'm going to go over this one really quickly. It's just making sure that when it comes to feedback, there's one moment and there's one voice. So if you are on a team and 5 people are feeding back to a creative team on one concept, make sure that you all get agreement on your feedback before you deliver that feedback to them. And when you do feedback to them, give them the feedback and then walk away. Don't dribble in feedback every hour or every day before the next creative meeting. Just let the creatives do their thing, let them work, and then give them the next round of feedback the next time you meet them. Feedback that is contradictory, feedback that is dribbling, that really just wears out creatives, and their energy is precious. And they don't need to be spending their energy on making sure that the feedback is all aligned or taking in little bits of information. So just respect that their energy is limited, their energy is precious, and we have to be really concise and consolidated in the type of feedback that we deliver. And then the last principle that I want to put here is this idea that data doesn't leap. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is something that kind of bothers me, what's going on in the industry right now. So that's why I want to talk about it. When we're working in creativity, we want our creators to make things that break through, that things that people will notice, things that will get the world's attention. And basically what those things are, they have to be inspiring. They should be pretty new and interesting. And yet often we judge these creative ideas primarily through the lens of existing data, which can only tell us what has worked in the past, not is what is going to work in the future. And I think we are doing our creatives and we're doing the industry a great disservice when we have the executional decisions around creativity being driven primarily by data, because creativity essentially is a process of leaping. And the best creative leaps into something that we recognize, but we haven't seen before. And if we keep looking to repeat the old patterns, and that's what data can give us, data can only give us the existing patterns, then we are hamstringing our creatives from taking the leaps that are necessary for campaigns and brands to ultimately be successful. I'm seeing this a lot on Instagram. I think we can all, if I said right now, what is an Instagram brand? I think everybody on this call, we would come up with a very similar list. It would be like, there's certain colors that we see over and over again. There's certain fonts. There's certain ways that things are modeled and styled. It's the Instagram look, or it's the millennial look. We have that whole stream of work going on as well, which are sometimes overlap and sometimes are a little bit different. And in the beginning, when we had these kinds of brands, when we had the Warby Parkers and the Caspers launching a long time ago, it was fresh. But what you started to see is people started to use that to define the algorithm. And now we're grinding brands and we're grinding creativity through these algorithms, and they're not giving us anything new. And I don't know about you, but I know in my work, in my own personal life, I find this fatiguing. And what I'm finding in my work is that my clients are having to spend a lot more money on acquiring customers because they don't just have innate breakthrough. because they are doing the best practices and they're copying what the algorithm is telling them what to do. So just protect your creatives. There are data bullies out there. There are people that say, well, this is how it works in this space, so therefore this is how you have to execute. As much as you can, protect your creatives from them. And one way to protect your creatives from them is when you know you have somebody who's like a real data wonk on your team. And we love data people because they help us in so many ways. Use their data in the briefing process as ways to think about principles of what works on certain platforms. Bring them in on that process so they feel included. And hopefully when it gets to the creative part, they will be less likely to slam them and say it has to work this way, right? So to quick recap, remember to have empathy. It's your greatest superpower as a professional and especially as a strategist. If there's nothing else you take from this, that would be the one thing I would encourage you to walk away with, is that empathy point. Always, always, always lead with what's working. It just puts better energy in the room. It opens up for better relationships. And it's just like a nicer way to be a human to another human. Get your strategic bones sorted out before you get into like executional minutia. As much as you can, resist the urge to solve it for creatives from an executional standpoint. Give them the principles of feedback. Let them solve for the execution. If things start to spin, your audience is your holy grail. That is the filter that you should be using. So if you ever have someone going off track, take a step back, go back to the audience, and 9 times out of 10, that's going to get you back on track. Practice your energetic jujitsu. Try not to fight fire with fire. Try to be loving. Try to be calm. Try to be zen. Remember that creative feedback has to be consolidated, or else you're going to drive your creatives absolutely fucking crazy. And just remember, data is wonderful, but data does not leap. It does not create that creative leap that we need to have breakthrough, amazing work. So use data where it should be used and be careful of using it where it shouldn't be used. So on that note, I'm going to open this up to the room. And if anyone has any questions or comments or just want to talk about anything, just unmute your mic and I will call on you.
I'm a big believer in, during briefing sessions, is to definitely bring the creative vibe that comes with that. I think kind of static sessions, very much sat in a dark room or a well-lit room with a whiteboard, nothing going on, just feels really uninspirational.
Yeah, totally.
And if you can kind of provide like the setting, or you've got any props, and just kind of bring in that kind of that buzz, just to get people amped up about, sometimes you've got a brief about a crappy product that you've got to try and get through versus, those briefs where you've got an A-list talent, and obviously it's always that balance. When giving feedback, have you got any advice in terms of that balance between being able to give feedback which feels obviously very constructive and direct versus that of still trying to lead with that kind of inspiration and that kind of buzz that keeps that room and keeps that kind of that flow going?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Ollie. I think a lot of it depends on, it goes back to the EQ point. It depends on the creatives you're working with, right? So if I'm working with, it tends to be older creatives, or more, let's not say older, let's say more experienced creatives. They don't really need the you-rah-rah. Like, they're pros, in my experience. They just want to get it done, right? So they don't need me to continue to tell them they're great or get them excited about things. But sometimes with younger creatives, I have to bolster them more emotionally because they're riding the process. Now, that being said, something that I really love doing with my creatives, and I think it plays nicely with what you're talking about, is actually supplementing or extending the briefing process. So like you, I really love having a experience of a brief, right? Like, if I can do anything to make it more experiential, I'm going to do it as a strategist. I feel like it just really sets the tone for the project. And then a lot of times what I do is I will set up either, I know it's old school, but it works really well, like a Tumblr or a private Instagram account where I continue to feed them stimulus and ideas. And I can do that based on creative feedback. So we can go into a meeting where they might be a little bit off and I want to like bring them back over a certain way. And over the next couple of days, I will feed them a couple Instagram posts that reinforces that and reinforces that in a visual or emotional or video way that you can't do it with words in the same way, right?
Yeah.
So I do think there is ways of keeping the energy up. And a lot of that just depends on the culture of your creative team and the types of creatives that you're working with.
I really love that. I think that's a really good idea. I think I've often used kind of channels and Tumblrs and Instagram for inspiration, but actually as part of that feedback channel, I think that's a really good build. Thank you.
My experience in the past has been that strategy is looked at as like delivering this wow moment. And that doesn't necessarily help everybody to be on the same page, especially around these like COVID. This has never happened before, but like things that are happening that change kind of the culture or the category. But I do think I've found some benefit of being the vulnerable intellectual, and I'm not an intellectual, but being the vulnerable one in the room and kind of admitting that like I don't always know all the answers, and pulse checking what I'm saying with people and seeing where it's resonating, because ultimately we're trying to inspire them to make something great. And I think sometimes when they look at strategy as delivering this big wow moment, you're kind of failing to inspire them because you kind of haven't gotten their buy-in the whole time. I don't know. It was just an observation about that empathy thing. I do think creativity is a vulnerable place to be, but I think strategy can benefit from being a little bit more vulnerable as well, or admitting that they are.
Yeah. I mean, the best projects I've ever worked on are the ones that I co-wrote the brief with my creative directors. Mm-hmm. And the aha moment for me in that is that I've had so many conversations with strategists, and myself have been on this complaint side of like, why won't the creatives let me into their process? Like they kick me out of their rooms. They won't talk to me about what they're working on, things like that. And then I kind of had this moment where I was like, well, I don't let them write the brief with me. So I've set the tonality of this. I've set the tonality that we go away and we come back with the wow moment. And as soon as I broke that in myself, because strategists set the tone for a project. We are the first deliverable. So the way that we handle that deliverable, both with clients, with creatives, with our teams, sets the tone of how not only like what work is going to be done, but how the work is going to be done. And as soon as I started to let creatives into my brief writing process, I became like the chick, man. I was in the creative rooms with them all the time. You know what I mean? Like I was their person. And it only took one project. It was literally, it was like a light switch where as soon as I opened up my process, they opened up theirs. I love that you brought that up though. There is vulnerability. And I think it's something with like the British DNA of strategy in the United States, especially, which I kind of roll my eyes at. I mean, I've had a lot of wonderful British mentors, but Jesus Christ. And there's that kind of like, we as Americans kind of put, as soon as you have that British accent, you put it on a pedestal. In fact, the kids I'm teaching right now are British. And so like, sometimes I have to remember that the 5-year-old isn't smarter than me just because she has the accent. You know what I mean?
I wonder how you might connect that to like what I often run into. It doesn't necessarily present as fear, but it presents as, these are the principles, right? These are the principles of design, or so there's the defending some of those things. So I just wondered how do you still connect all of those to an even underlying fear, or how you manage through some of those sorts of responses?
That's a really good question. So I operate from a life philosophy in general, in all aspects of my life, that every action either is coming from a place of fear or a place of love. Those are the two core motivators of action. And whenever I catch myself behaving badly, which happens more often than I like, I will ask myself, Heidi, what are you afraid of? And I like put myself in a room. I give myself a timeout and I ask myself, like, what is that thing that you're actually afraid of? So I do believe that bad behavior of any kind, whether it's aggression or rudeness or, territorialism or whatever, is coming from a place of fear. And so there is a question of how people are using those principles, right? That you're talking about, like the design principles. Because then sometimes it's like, no, like I'm just trying to like, it can come from a place of love. It can come from a place like I'm, like these work, they're pretty cool. Like they inspire me. Or other times it's like, this is how we do it because this is the way it's done, right? And I think in that thing that we need to bring in one of the most important skill sets that we have as strategists is EQ, right? And understanding like, okay, where is that comment coming from? And if it's coming from a place of fear, what is this person really afraid of? And how can we get rid of that fear so we can get past this surface conversation? So it's a little more psychological, But I find often in so much of the work that I do, whether it's with clients or it's with creatives, I'm actually in many ways almost like a therapist with them, because people are afraid. And if you can help people not be afraid, then you can really get a lot of stuff done with people.
Love that. Thank you. I actually used to be a therapist, so it's coming in really handy.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. I mean, nothing like a scared creative to make a stretch like that you have to like deal with and be like, okay, how can I get you out of this fear cycle? Because ultimately, if creatives stay in the fear cycle too long, they'll freeze up. And that's like, you don't want them to get that block. So how can you help them not have that block?
Thank you.
Of course.
I'm curious, like, what kind of steps you would take after a briefing to like check in with the creatives, or do you just kind of leave them until the creative is ready? I don't know.
It's a great question. It can often very much depend on the creative's personality as well, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately, the best relationships you have are the ones where it's very riffy and bouncy, and you can pop in as much as, you know, you feel like you need to. But what I do try to do, even with my closest creatives, the ones that I really had great working relationships with, after that initial briefing, I give them 48 hours to breathe and take it in and process. And after 48 hours, if the assignment allows it, we used to have lots of time to do this stuff, you know, so it might not be like that anymore. But I try to give them a decent amount of time to process and say, and in the briefing say, I'm going to check in with you in X amount of time. So there's an expectation around that. Something else that I like to do with creatives, like ultimately creatives want to feel supported, and they want to feel that you're not trying to whip them into a certain space, but you're there to help them, right? So I do a lot of follow-up briefing materials. So I do things like, I know it's a little old school, but I like setting up a Tumblr. Tumblrs are great. Like you can, and just continuously feed the creative with some really visual, inspiring stuff. The modern day version of that is a private Instagram account, like where you, except the problem now with the algorithm, you don't always know if the creatives are going to get it in their feed, like you used to be able to get it in the feed. But setting up ways to continually pitter patter information into them. A Slack channel is a great way to do it. And a Slack channel that's just dedicated towards ideas and inspiration is probably the best way to do it right now as I'm talking through this. But just letting them know that they're supported, which then allows for the conversation. Because if you put something on that Slack channel, you can go to them in a couple hours and say, hey, what did you think of that thing? It gives you an excuse. So it doesn't seem like you're like mom checking in.
Yeah.
I think some of the thing, like, as I've been trying to give more, I feel like I come from a very like agreeable place. And so I've actually been trying to get better at being, developing a style for constructive feedback, and being assertive about it. And so I guess I'm just interested. I think there's almost like at least I feel like there's like this process you have to go through where you have to figure out what your voice is like, and like developing your own voice to say things that are difficult or negative or confrontational. And so I'm just kind of interested if you've had to go on that journey, if that's something that, if there's anything you learned in trying to develop your voice on how you give tough feedback.
Oh God, yes. Yes. And I think this is difficult. And I think, you know, we talked about this on our chat yesterday. I think this is difficult for young women strategists, especially because I remember when I was in my mid-20s being like, oh, I can't wait till I'm 35 because then people are going to think I'm older and smarter and they're going to listen to my feedback more. Mm-hmm. And I think actually strategy is one of the disciplines where it helps to be older in the industry, whereas in other disciplines, not as much, right?
Yeah.
So for me, there's a mantra that I keep in my mind, and that is that the facts are neutral. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by the facts are neutral is whenever I have to give tough feedback on anything, whether it's employee reviews, a client, something's not working with a client, or creative feedback, I just remind myself that this doesn't have to be emotional. Like it is my job to just deliver it and say like, you know what? I don't think that's working the right way. And that is the fact about what I feel about this, that this isn't answering the brief as strong as it could. Let's talk about it, but you don't have to be embarrassed about it. And I think for a long time, I was always trying to like be the nice one and deliver the feedback in a way that didn't hurt anyone's feelings and all that kind of stuff. And like, it's not that you're an asshole, right? Like, I think there is a tendency to swing over into asshole, like where you swing the opposite way because you're trying to be tough, but can you sit in the middle and really just embrace the fact that like, we're just here to have the conversation and it doesn't have to get super emotional. Another thing that has helped me navigate this in myself, and this is an ongoing navigation, this is not something that's easy for me still today, is, and I know this is so cheesy, but Brene Brown. I'm not a big Brene Brown person, but I was listening to one of her audiobooks, and she had this advice when you're in situations, and her advice was neither lean in nor lean back, but just be. And just be who you authentically are in that moment. Don't try to razzle dazzle and lean in. Don't be afraid of what you have to say and lean back. Just be in the middle space. And it was like 10 minutes into the book and I didn't listen to any more of the book after that. But, but I've thought about that quite a bit, about like moments when I'm trying to lean in and get people to like me, and moments when I'm trying to lean back so I don't freak anybody out with my energy. And what is it like when you just sit in the middle space, which I thought was really lovely. So maybe it's something about trying to channel your middle energy the next time you're giving feedback and seeing how that works. And I do think it is a lot of trial and error in this, of like, how does it feel like when I give feedback this way or when I give it that way? Like a lot of times we just have to try it out and find the mode that works really well for us.
So this one's about the emotional jujitsu piece, because, and I know like the example of the asshole that you used was like a dude. And this is like the thing that and actually it's funny because it actually happens maybe more with accounts than it does with creatives sometimes. But where I get into this like weird emotional kind of situation where someone is being very aggro, and it's usually a guy, and then like finding these strategies on how to like pacify them feels like I'm playing a really kind of like unsavory, outdated female role. And like, sometimes it feels really good to have it out with someone, like, but I don't know, I guess, I don't know if what I'm saying is a question, but it's more like what do you do when that jujitsu further kind of like compounds really unhealthy gender dynamics?
Yeah. I love this question. And I've experienced this so much as a woman strategist in the field, especially when I was younger. Like me being a 24-year-old strategist trying to work with these, big dick creative directors, and feeling that I had to like, to get them to listen and be cute and like play to their ego. Like it's definitely a thing. In fact, when I was younger, not to go too off track on this answer, I remember always thinking, oh, I can't wait till I'm like 35 and older as a strategist, because then I feel like people are going to listen to me more. And actually they do, but that's probably another conversation for another day. But I don't have a perfect answer to this. But there is a mantra that I really like to use when I'm put in situations like this. And the mantra is the facts are neutral. And what that's really saying is like, I'm just going to be straight with you and tell you the facts in the way that I'm perceiving this. And I'm going to deliver this in a very even tone, and I'm not going to cater to you. We're not going to like play this emotional game. We're just going to talk about the work, and we're just going to talk about what's up, And sometimes I do not at all ever want to say this is the younger woman's fault, because I've so been in this situation before. But sometimes when I would approach, one of the mistakes that I used to make when I was younger is that I would assume the gender dynamic myself. And I would go in being kind of like submissive and cute and like, And then when I hit like my late 20s, I think I understood how to walk into a room and just be, and not play into the dynamics myself. And if they were playing into it, just kind of cutting it off, and not cutting it off in a mean way, but just not playing the game. And for me personally, that's helped. Like, you don't have to play the game, Heidi. The facts are neutral. Just deliver the feedback. And if this person is still too much of a dick to deal with it, then like, I'm sorry, like I'm not going to compromise who I am in that. And I feel like we have a lot more permission to do that as women than we did 15 years ago when I started. But I'm not saying it's perfect yet either, because I still get into rooms with older male clients where there's that, they expect that kind of like ass kissing, you know? And I've just gotten to the point, and maybe because I'm older and cranky, where I just don't want to play the game anymore. So I just don't. But I guess I would just, a long-winded way of saying, sorry, I've never been asked this question before, so I'm just kind of like meandering through the answer. I think a long way of saying is like, just know that like, if what you're delivering is true, and if it's really reflective of your opinion, just have confidence in that. And as much as possible, try not to play that game. Because again, if you think about the 50% thing from up front, there's each relationship is 100%. If your 50% is not playing that game and they have nothing to volley with or nothing to react to, it's really hard for them to play the game on the other side too.
Right.
But I don't want to put it all on us. I want to be very clear about that. Like, it takes both of us, but like, there's just a point where it's just like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it this way. Sorry, get me fired. I don't know, you know.
Love it.
One other note on the, if you meet like really aggressive creatives, to your point about someone being like a jerk, I find that in those experiences, I tend to shut down and I'm not really able to effectively respond. And I think that's just like probably part of having more of those experiences and getting used to them and just being cognizant. A few times I've actually like pulled the creative aside after the meeting, just one-on-one, and shared with them like how their feedback had made me feel, and just and then say, so I went afterwards and thought about it, and here's what I was trying to convey. So I feel like that goes a little bit along the lines of trying to build a relationship. But that's a helpful tip that I've found.
I think that's great. I think that sometimes that's a good point, and I probably should add one of that as one of the principles, is that sometimes when you're dealing with a creative like that, it's not going to get solved in the room because emotions are running too high. And I think there's something in being a strategist in creative feedback sessions where we have to be so highly tuned. We have to have our IQ up to 200% when we're in those rooms. And if the creative is shutting down, or if we're getting frustrated and we want to shut down, sometimes it's okay to call it and say, you know what, I need to go think about this a little bit, and blame it on yourself, right? Like, don't say you're being a jerk. Just be like, you know what, I need to think about this a little bit. Why don't we regroup in an hour or so, so I can be more clear in what I'm trying to say? Because I don't, you know, and I think that's a really good way of like backing off of it and really being tuned to what's happening in the room. And in any of the situations, either what I talked about or what you've offered up, which I think is great, the principle here is don't escalate the negative emotions, right? Like, don't get in the pissing match. Like, I have seen the pissing matches go down, and then you have a breakdown of that relationship for the next month, and work sucks for the next month, and the product gets shitty and the creative gets shitty, and it's just like, ugh, it just sucks. So as much as we can, you can still maintain your pride and your integrity without punching back against a creative that's escalating things emotionally. Yeah, that's great. I love that. Thank you, Emily, for adding that in.
We have this kind of ongoing situation with our experience with Google, where they claim that they want these very big, like blue sky ideas, and they want to be a disruptive brand. And then we've gotten into this cycle where those big ideas that the creative team brings to the table, many of which are fantastic, many of which we've seen like other competitors end up doing on their own, we see our ideas being shot down. And it happens on such a consistent basis that it's affecting the morale of the creative team. So I'm wondering if you have any feedback, because a lot of this feedback is as part of like the post creative process, like once they've actually put their ideas together, how we address feedback for those ideas. But when we go into our actual strategy kickoffs with the creative team, they're already walking in with their heads down because they're still getting over. It's like PTSD. They're getting over the ground.
I totally get it.
Yeah. So any feedback around just like how to mitigate that, or to keep morale high, or to have an optimistic viewpoint going forward, like how to actually like inject that with the creative team?
That's a really great question. And it is something that happens with Google quite a bit. I've worked on tons of Google business. And look, I've had great experiences with Google. I've had great Google clients. But there is kind of this thread that also exists in Google's culture of shoot it down, shoot it down, shoot it down, especially when it comes to creativity. And I've worked on teams that have been in that exact same creativity spin with Google. So I can empathize with what you're talking about. At the end of the day, in our experience with Google, when we ran into those moments where it just kept getting bludgeoned, they just wouldn't buy anything. We would, instead of doing another round of work, we would stop work and we would have a reset moment with our clients. And we would do a thing. I mean, I've been in a couple of Google meetings like this before where however much room it takes, we got a room that was big enough to coat with all the ideas that we ever presented to them. And sometimes we had to get a really big room to do that. And then walk through with the client. We need to understand, to my earlier point, we need to understand the principles of what's not working, not that the fact that this execution isn't working. And we need to understand it across the range of this work because we want to ultimately get this right, but we need more from you so we can get it right. So I do think with certain clients, and Google's not the only one, I don't mean to demonize Google in this. Again, I've had a lot of great experiences with Google as well, but there are clients that are like that where it's just no, 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 no. And at a certain point, you need to stop the creative process and get back to just almost like a coming to Jesus moment with them and say, let's have some real talk. Let's figure out what's going on.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. It was really clear. And I got a lot out of it. So thank you. One question I was thinking about for myself that I've struggled with is kind of really wanting some kind of design object, whether it's some kind of design asset to be on brief, on strategy, but then feeling like I impose sort of too heavily the demand for it to be on strategy and kind of constrain it from taking a creative leap versus seeing creative work that I'm that it takes so many creative leaps that feels I don't see my strategy in it anymore, and sort of being able to pull apart, is that some ego or is it has it gone too far? So how do you, and I feel there's probably just some experience in that, but I'd be curious if you have any ways of coping with that situation. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. First of all, trust your gut on that if it's leapt so far that the strategy is left behind, it probably has, right? And I'm going to say something that people are probably going to disagree with, either in this group or at the world at large is going to disagree with. If I were a client, I would rather have a piece of work that is strategically sound but not creatively great versus a piece of work that is creatively fantastic but does not solve the business problem. And yes, that's a reason why we have a lot of crappy work out in the world, because people do settle for just what is strategically sound. But if I had to choose between those two things, I would choose for the one that's actually going to work against my business and get across the message that we need to get across. So there's no shame in saying, hey, I don't really think the strategy of what we're trying to say is coming across. And in doing that, one way to neutralize your language around that is not do what I just did by saying, I don't think the strategy is getting across because I'm the strategist. And so creatives will be like, oh, you're pissed off that your thing isn't happening. Instead, just saying, do we think this is going to get people to think what we want them to think? Do we think that people are going to do what we want to do? And in that moment, removing the S word from the creative feedback actually can be really powerful in depersonalizing it from you and your profession and your ego and making it more about what we're trying to achieve.
I kind of just wanted to go back to that first question that we talked about a bit, just about when something goes off strategy, because I guess I'm wondering if you've ever experienced where something goes off strategy, but it's still going to help reach that objective, or it almost beats the strategy that you had laid out. Have you ever experienced that, and how did that work?
Yes, I have experienced that, where I thought the strategy was brilliant, but and I think you made a really great distinction here between the objective of the campaign versus the strategy that you go for it, right? So if it's early enough in the creative process where you haven't deployed a ton of other creatives or a ton of other spaces against that strategy. So say you're still like in the really early ideation phase, you're trying to get to like a core center of the campaign that will then radiate out. I'm okay changing it. I am. And I remember, I don't know if people still say this, but I remember there being such disdain for backing the strategy in. Like there's a great creative spot and you back the strategy in. I'm like, I don't give a fuck if it works. I'm going to back that strategy in. like we don't have to be such purists about this, right?
Yeah.
So I think just to correct what I said earlier with Anna, like if it's off strategy and not going to work, yes, it has to like get reined in. But if it's not fitting neatly into your strategy, but actually it's a pretty brilliant way to solve it, and you think in your gut based on everything you know about the audience, it's going to work. Well, then that's where we have to accept feedback on our work and let go of our ego and say, you know what, the team's going somewhere that's more brilliant. I'm going to support them in that.
Yeah, I think I've heard like multiple sides of that debate of like, if you think strategies be like, you know, do you back it in or not?
Yeah, backing it in used to be such a dirty phrase. In fact, I think it still is a dirty phrase. Strategists hate backing it in. But I think that the idea of backing it in comes from a really old school linear way of thinking where we used to have these handoffs, right? So client would brief the agency, the strategist would go away and come up with the strategy. They'd be often doing their thing for God knows how long. They would come down from the hill and grant the strategy to the creatives. The creatives would then go off and work and the strategist would disappear. And then it would move through the cycles. And I think that's actually a pretty old school way of thinking about it. You know, new school teams, or not even new school, just like teams, are more about like mosh pits, and they're all working together. And yeah, like strategist is the first one that has to have a deliverable and put something down and put an idea down. But I think with the way that it works now, it's okay if the mosh pit creates something different, as long as it all works. As long as it still works for the strategist. Like, yeah, you know what, that does make a lot of sense. We can go that way.
Yeah, definitely.
I was thinking about your number 3 point, the strategic feedback first, then creative, and a situation that I've kind of had recently. So I'm wondering if you were in a situation where you were in the rounds of creative feedback and then something happened in the world and the strategy was no longer relevant, like with COVID-19 and kind of how that's shaped what's appropriate for strategy. How would you suggest going about giving creative feedback when it's not so much an issue with the creative, but the strategy is actually what needs to be reworked?
Awesome question. And this is where you have to pull the strategist card, right? And what a strategist is ultimately responsible for in a process is bringing the audience into the room, bringing culture into the room, and bringing a really strong awareness of the competitive context and a really strong understanding of the client's business. And of those 4 forces, let me use this instead of my thumb, of those 4 forces, if any of those go through a radical shift, you are within your right to say, hold on a second, I think we need to actually stop this process. I need to do some rethink about what's going on. And then we need to rethink the way we approach the creative. Because unfortunately, if you don't do that, you start to get like Frankenstein happening, where you're trying to like force fit something that was right, but something radically changed. And now it's just not going to ever fit anymore. And then it gets real ugly. I mean, this will get ugly in 3 weeks. Like you're going to think that you can, if we just shape it a little bit, it'll be fine. It won't. So take the moment to take the step back. And, the step back could take maybe 2 or 3 days. It doesn't have to be a radical derailing of the process, but trust me, everyone will appreciate it longer in the long run than if you keep trying to like jam something through that wasn't built to go through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we have to have confidence as strategists to be able to say that, right?
Absolutely.
There is kind of a strand in our DNA of strategists that I don't think helps us sometimes, that we are the intellectuals of the industry and we always have the right answer. And when we bring the brief down, it's like, like it's supposed to be amazing, right? I think we need to work as strategists to kind of break that and allow our processes to sometimes be messy, especially when something like COVID-19 happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or Lexi, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I'm a freelance strategist, and one of the things that I am grappling with is as a freelance strategist, you come into a project, you have a short amount of time, you don't have, you're coming in cold.
Yeah.
How do you have any tips on how to ramp up some of these principles? I mean, I can see that some of them are already kind of like they feel foundational, but then others kind of need a little bit more massaging and more finessing and more time to kind of, build and warm up with the creative team. Do you have any tips on how a freelance strategist could just get it going?
Lexi, that is a great question, because my best creative partnerships were partnerships that I had with creatives for months, if not years, right? So how do you get to that intimacy more quickly? And the fastest way that I do it now, because I'm in a similar situation, I'm now back in assassin mode where I'm jumping in and out of teams, right? Is go in with the posture and the language of that you are there to help them. So how can I help you? What kind of briefing would be most helpful to you? How do you take in information? Does this make sense to you? I think we should check in 2 days. What do you think about that? Like having that back and forth conversation doesn't mean you're a wet noodle. It doesn't mean like you're their bitch. It's not any of that stuff, but it's really going in and saying, like, demonstrating that you are here for the team and that you are not just here as that discipline. And another way that I help crack through this on new teams is that I try to demonstrate helpfulness throughout the course of the project. And let me get more specific about that. Of course, there is the briefing moment, like when you're getting in there and you're talking about it. But a way that I have been able to keep conversation open with teams is creating either a Slack channel or a private Instagram account, or back in the day it was Tumblr. I think people still use Tumblr a little bit. But saying like, okay, I briefed you on this, but every day I'm going to hit you with another thought, another idea, some stimulus, something that will be helpful to you on your journey. And I think by showing continued helpfulness, you can get to the intimacy faster than you would in a traditional setup.
Say hi. Hi. So I'm kind of a creative at heart. So I started as a copywriter as well and still do it on the side. So hallelujah to all of this. But the question I have is, how do you deal with execs who don't get it? So you have aligned on the brief, like I'm now client side. Like if you've aligned on the brief, like everybody seems to be like good and solid on the direction that you're going, and you get the creative, and the execs are kind of like dazzled / distracted by the creative and lose complete sight of the brief and the strategy. Do you have any suggestions on how to get people back on track when they have the ability to completely destroy your campaign?
So are you saying that they choose something that isn't right? Or are you saying that they manipulate something so it's terrible?
It's that they have a hard time seeing the creative from a strategic perspective, no matter, because they're just like so distracted by colors or different aspects of the creative execution. And, you try to get them back on track by reminding them of the creative. But, I've been in 2 situations now where we've ended up in a rebrief to agency.
Got it.
Like after we've received the first round of creative. And so any of your advice on dealing with execs who don't get it and who don't get marketing would be like very appreciated.
Yeah, sure. And I'd love to open this up to the room as well, because I know there's a lot of experience on this call on this. The one thing I will say on that, and I've worked with this a lot in certain sectors where it's just such a big jump for these execs to understand it. A lot of times I have to do extra meetings with them to teach them about what they're going to see. So instead of just saying, okay, the next step is we agreed on the brief and now we're going to see the creative work. And that jump that we can normally do with like CPG or, companies that grow up with really strong marketing departments. I actually have a set of presentations that I do for these types of execs that are like, so this is what we look for when we see a creative idea. These are the elements we're going to see. This is the role of color versus the role of strategy. And And as much as I can, I try to get ahead of that. And sometimes that means that I have to educate them on how to be a quote unquote marketing client, especially since a lot of these execs may not have grown up in industries where there is a strong marketing component in it. But I see Eric's unmuted, and I'm sure Eric has a point of view on this. So fire away, Eric.
Quick question back to Meredith. Meredith, are they reacting because they're enamored by the creative and they sort of leave? You feel like they're leaving the strategy behind, or is it that they're being so dogmatic about the strategy that they're not getting the creative? And that's the question. But I'm gonna preface, or I'm gonna say one more kind of element to it that I've sort of had to learn over the years. And a tool that I've implemented with clients is there's as many different types of clients as there are different types of creatives, and sort of matching up the type of creative and the creative output with the type of client is always maddening, right? But what I've implemented or started to do earlier is actually to have my clients take a quick personality test. The quick personality test, it's a cursory but important way of me managing my own expectations of how they're going to digest the strategy and how they're going to digest the creative. Sometimes they want to be provoked, even if they're kind of quiet. Sometimes they talk big, but when when great creative lands on their desk, they have absolutely no idea how to digest it. And so having some advanced idea on who they are from a personality perspective actually helps me in selling the creative work through based on their kind of expectations and mindset.
That's really smart. I'm going to do that from now on. That's super smart.
Eric, do you have a... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
In our case, I mean, I'm a not-for-profit and I work in healthcare. So there's like a very traditional way that, because in Canada, like healthcare is universal, and it's, when people donate to hospitals quite often because they're all public institutions. And there's a very traditional way that healthcare is marketed. And I'm sure that's the same way like in healthcare marketing in the States. Mm-hmm. But our organization has deliberately chosen to market ourselves completely differently and outside the box. And so my boss, for example, she doesn't come from a marketing background at all. She overthinks things. She gets really anxious. She needs a lot of validation from a lot of different people. And so often when we've aligned on the strategy and she's okay with it because it makes sense strategically. But then when we get the creative and it looks like it meets the strategy, but it looks so different from, what other hospitals are doing. She gets very anxious. So that's the challenge that we have. But I think, Heidi, your point to educating her as to what she's going to see is really smart. And I've never thought to do that before.
Yeah. And it also, one more tool you might want to put in your toolbox on this is, it sounds like another thing that it's when clients react like this, it's because they have the big aha reveal moment. Mm-hmm. I would guess, just based on what you're describing, that she would benefit from being brought along a little bit more on the process.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've tried to do.
Okay. So you tried that one. Okay, cool.
I've tried that one, but still, she is just, I guess, very visual, for example. And so when she sees a piece of, like when she sees like the digital creative that's going out and it doesn't look like what X hospital or Y hospital is doing. And it's just dramatically different because we use like a very design heavy, kind of like visual expression over like, pictures of doctors or, and we use like our messaging is also just very different. And so like, she'll see that and then she'll start comparing what we're doing to what other organizations in our industry are doing. And it's just so different that she gets scared.
Well, and another
anxiety and fear.
Yeah, I hear you. And I want to open this up for other people. But just one last note on this topic. Another thing I think I've had clients like this that say they want something radically different, but then they don't. Yeah. Have them do a in the beginning, a friend exercise. These are the types of brands that we want to be in our friend group. And there will be not hospitals in that, right?
Yeah.
And then I would take the extra moment to go through and interrogate how those brands communicate. And then when you go back to right before you present the creative, say, remember, we said we didn't want to be like hospitals. We wanted to be we wanted these brands to be our friends, which means that we have to follow these types of rules and do these types of things. And hopefully you're reminding her in that moment of the decision that she made that went into the brief that the creatives took very seriously. And that's why the creatives aren't giving you hospital. Like, just remind her, like, remember, we agreed on this. Like, this is what we agreed on. We were going to be different. And sometimes you just have to like almost recap. That's account management, right? Like recap what happened a bunch of times before to remind them of the bravery that they agreed to do.
Yeah.
So
the one thing scenario that I just never want to repeat ever again.
Yeah, I get it. Adrienne, did you have something you wanted to pop in on that?
The one thing I was going to say, because I have seen that movie a lot and been a part of it. And the one thing that I've learned is that the CSA, especially when the clients are briefing us, and I've had to brief shit like 4 times in a month because the client's going to line. And what I realized painfully later was, had I done a competitive gallery wall so that the clients could literally see what are the headlines, what are the CTAs, what are all the things, so that like their theater of the mind, but especially if you're coming back with a new campaign idea, if they literally can see the things that are working or not working before they have to judge work, that will save you and your creative team lots of therapy. And it takes time to do it, to Heidi's point, but like the more upstream that you can get from like when they brief you in and what the mandatories and deliverables are, to make them accountable so you don't have to rebrief. And meaning like managing your execs, that like, here is the brief, here is the work that we're trying to really like push against. Like, you see, there aren't any people in all this work, whatever it is. And especially if you have data to show everybody's doing the same thing too, that quickly helps move this along so that they're not caught up in the shiny objects. And I'm happy to workshop any of this with you, because I've done that a few times in terms of helping clients. And also the other big thing I would say is that when you come and do it together with whoever your agency partner is, whether it's the strategist, if you can get the strategist and the creative to talk through the brief and where it is, that neutrality and clarity also really helps, because the education is rooted in a conversation versus like, you're wrong, you're right, you know, like the finger pointing and mind reading. Because a lot of times those execs do not want to show creatives all the stuff that you're saying.
So I'm pretty young in my creative and strategy journey. And so I guess I'm wondering, as far as kind of putting together a portfolio and really just engaging people and kind of getting in the door, I guess, do you have any kind of advice or kind of words to speak to that? Obviously, it's a weird time to get hired. It's a weird time to work with people. But I mean, I'm just wondering, do you have any advice as far as kind of getting in that door to that initial step?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's tough right now, obviously. You know, and I really sympathize with where you're at in it. I came to New York about a week before September 11th happened, and I couldn't get a job for 2 years when I first started. So I completely understand. Like, anyone that's trying to enter right now, I think it's going to be tough. We'll see. We'll see what happens with the economy, but we'll see. So something that I learned then is that I think when I first moved into New York, I had a lot of like swagger around the kind of agency that I wanted to work for. And I was like, I'm not going to work at these agencies, and I'm going to work for this one. You know what I mean? I had my list of absolutes and my list of absolutes nots. And FCB New York was not on my absolute list at all, right? But after 2 years of waiting tables in New York, that was the job offer that came through. And that's a job offer that I took. And I'm really grateful for the fact that I took that job there. I learned so much working at a big agency on big clients. And the people that mentored me there are still my mentors today. It's crazy. There was a real community that built up around there. And so a long way of saying, I always tell people that people don't blame you for your first job. They don't judge you for your first job, but they're going to judge your second job. And a lot of times in this industry, it's especially in moments like this, it's about getting your foot in the door and just getting the career going. And then when you get a little more experience under your belt and when you understand yourself a little bit more, then you can start to be a little more picky and choosy about the moves that you're making. I've seen a lot of people, when I used to run W&W, I'd have coffee with a lot of people who were, 21, 22, just coming out of college. And they would say, I only want to work at these 5 agencies. And I only want to work on clients that are purpose led. And I only want to work on work that aligns with my personal values. And I was like, good fucking luck. like, I can't even make all those demands right now when it comes to doing work. But I'm sure they're going to listen to your inexperienced 21-year-old self when it comes to that list of demands. And so I don't mean to be like harsh and rude about it, but sometimes it's just about like getting in there, getting it going. And then I'm also a really big believer that it's your fault if you don't learn something where you're at.
Totally.
Like, I don't care how shitty your boss is. I don't care how shitty the environment is. If anything, you're learning how you don't want to run a team and how you don't want to run a company when you do it someday. So that's what I say to people in this position.
Yeah, I definitely so far have been kind of taking a different route. So a lot of like asking people to coffee. Well, obviously before.
Right.
Yeah, but asking people to coffee or virtual coffee, I guess, nowadays. But just really kind of being like, hey, can I pick your brain about what you've done? I think that people have been really receptive that way. Not many people, especially strategists, say no to free coffee.
Sure.
I found out. So doing things like that, kind of going definitely nowadays off the beaten track. So like kind of going to different people, maybe in-house or even just like random like tech people, tech companies, and just kind of like their marketing plans. So kind of really navigating how to, break in somewhere. Sure.
And can I just add one more thing on there?
Yeah, of course.
And I'll open it up again. I'm sorry to monopolize so much time. Something that this whole getting coffee thing, right? I get asked to get coffee quite a bit with people, and I try to do my best and get coffee with as many people as I can. But sometimes you're just like, I'm running a business, I'm traveling, I can't do it. I'll have coffee with a person once, and to be quite honest with you, that person over a month or so will probably slip out of my brain, and I won't keep them in mind when it comes to an opening or something like that.
Totally.
So on your side of it, there's time that you invest in getting the coffees, which I think is helpful, right? Yeah. But also think about putting your energy to 2 to 5 people that you're really trying to build the relationship with.
Definitely.
So something that people have done with me really brilliantly is I have a couple of strategists who, every 2 months or so, they send me an article that they think I might like. And they're right. They're always right. And I'm always grateful. And it shows me that they're invested. And I remember them. And so when something opens up, I will make sure that, I talk to them first. And so there's this difference between like meeting a bunch of people and networking and finding people that will mentor you. And that's a huge gap, right? There's a massive gap between the coffee people and the mentoring people. And I think there's this weird thing where sometimes people will be like, will you be my mentor? And I'm like, I don't even know you. Like mentorship is a 2-way thing. Like I take that seriously, the people that I mentor, right? So I think there's like the getting coffee side, there's the keeping your pulse with this person, but in a way that's useful to the person. And then there's mentorship. And I think a lot of people, when they start out in the industry, they focus so much on the coffee thing. They should hone in and pick 3 to 5 people that they're trying to like pulse, which will eventually perhaps translate into mentor. And the mentor is going to help you like crazy. They're going to help you get any job, right? So just keep those 3 levels in mind when you're starting to do your thing.